Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening and for wanting to hear me ramble about one of my chosen topics, that is pewter making things and casting. As I said at the beginning, here's my credentials, which I'm now going to set aside because they're heavy and totally unnecessary for this activity. And in fact, this hat has a bunch of pewter on it and is a good example of some of the kinds of pewter work that we're talking about today. I'm going to take my eye protection off, although we'll talk about that as well too. So the first thing is, hey, what is pewter? What are we talking about at all? Pewter is, generally speaking, tin alloys. In most of the examples that are found and cataloged are listed as lead tin in the Dutch, or lead alloy. Lead and tin melt at relatively low temperatures. You can melt them over charcoal fires. And so it's a very attainable kind of metalworking, much lower temperatures than bronze or silver casting would require. And of course, it is shiny, relatively speaking. More lead is less shiny. We work with lead-free pewter because then we can happily work and not worry about getting the filings and so forth into our systems in a way that will make us sick with lead. Lead is not dangerous to cast. It doesn't aromatically come up into the air when you're casting it, but it is the filing and handling it later that cause us pause and worry. And because lead-free pewter is available on the market now, we buy lead-free pewter. And as we know, site tokens are frequently worn around the neck and children put them in their mouths. So we just don't involve lead in site tokens. And that's a lot of the casting that we do. The actual alloy of the pewters that are available can vary. I buy mine direct from rotometals.com. Rotometals is who we've bought pewter from for a long time. Pewter has gotten a lot more expensive than it used to be. When I started, it was around $8 a pound, and I think, I'm looking for their page right now, it was around $21 a pound. Oh, it's on sale for $19 a pound right now. So it's more than doubled in the last decade. The pewter handout, the class handout that I'll show you on the guild page in a little bit, is dated from 2006. So it's interesting to see some of our links and our knowledge have changed a little bit since that time, of course. But this does show us what is in the alloys. R98 is my go-to alloy. This is what 1 pound of pewter looks like. It's very small. It's about 4 inches by 1.5 inches by 1/2 inch. They used to send us 5-pound ingots. I really like the 1 pound ingot. They're way more convenient for small castings. People do look for pewter from other sources, from melting down pewter objects and things from garage sales and so forth. This can be dicey. We don't necessarily know what's in it, and pewter might be actually aluminum or some other pot metal. So I have always chosen for my casting to cough up the money for direct pewter because the individual item weight is so small that even with this doubled cost of pewter, the actual cost per item is always less than $1 an item. So by a lot. So generally speaking, I think it's worth buying. Your mileage may vary, but that's my warning to you, is that when you're looking to just melt something down that's pewter, if you don't know where it's from, you don't know what's in it. They also behave a little bit differently. R98 is a good balance of flexibility and strength. Some people cast pure tin, which is very, very shiny. The R92 and AC pewter are other options. And as you can see, they have antimony, copper, and or bismuth in them as the other elements. Obviously, no lead. That's the question of what is pewter. When we're talking about pewter casting, it easily gets combined with, what are we talking about making? And what do we mean by pewter casting? I'm not talking about pewter dishes and candlesticks and things like that, which is a whole set of skills, and a lot of what you see in the guild records and things are about that kind of pewter making. which is amazing, and I actually know nothing about. So let me just be very clear that I'm talking about the casting of small tokens and trinkets, like the things on my hat, buttons, bells, pins, pendants, amules. There are a lot of little things that are made. Pewter is so easy to work with and so easy to cast that in a lot of ways it's the cheap plastic jewelry of the Middle Ages, and it's a cheap plastic material. A lot of toys are made in pewter and found. There's a wonderful book I have from the Museum of London called Toys and Trinkets, and a lot of it does go into the 17th century, but it does have an amazing array of plates and little miniature things that were made in pewter, and of course the earliest toy soldiers. That continues into this modern day, but especially in the 19th century, those cast lead soldiers, that's a pretty direct line from what we see in pewter casting in the early years. Pewter casting does exist modernly as well, and it is often done modernly with what's called RTV, that's room temperature vulcanization. That is rubber molds or silicone molds. There's levels of detail and forms that can be cast with a flexible material mold that are entirely different than what we can do in a stone mold. So the limitations of what we do are very much limited by the material that we're using to do it in, and that I find does help us lead towards an aesthetic closer to what we're trying to recreate. It's certainly, there's a lot of pewter casting to get into in the modern era, which again, I know fairly little about. I know enough about to explain what it is, but that's not what I'll be addressing here. What we find in the extant finds, we are very blessed to have a website from a university in the Netherlands. Go to their regular page here if I can. Terra. They do have an English language version of this as well. Pretty much devoted to small pewter finds of this type. It does an amazing job, particularly of sorting the badges and finds, ampullae are the other things, geographically and by topic. This is the Kunera webpage. I've already clicked on the British flag was there previously to bring me to the English language. They have some fascinating articles and topics, but usually it's search badges and ampullae, what we're clicking on. Then we see this wonderful database. And as interesting as the geographic distribution is, and I will say that a lot of what we're going to see are from the Netherlands and Britain particularly. There's a lot of that's material based. They have a lot more pewter available. Like there's more lead and tin being mined in those regions. But also to some extent, that's what's been found in those regions particularly. And the people who've collected these records have been in those regions. So we'll set that aside because it will just get in our way. But over here on the side of the color, they broke down what they have by topic. And under religious, you can see there's Christ, all sorts of particular topics. Many, many, many of the finds that we have, these are all the Mary-related topics, are pilgrimage badges. They are tokens that were created literally as souvenirs, as proof that you could purchase to show that you had been to a holy site. Thomas Becket is an entire industry of pewter badges related to St. Thomas Becket, and so many of the British finds relate to him, and they exist for so many centuries. It was a way to show that you've gone, so it isn't simply money spending and nostalgia as we might think of souvenirs today. It was literally a desire to bring some contact with the holy place with you and to take some of that holiness with people. As anything that proliferates and is common in culture, there also exists a great deal that is comedic and counter to it. So in addition to a great many secular badges, that is to say, potentially associated with a household badge or topics of just hearts and romance, jewelry. There are also a great many profane badges. I suppose I should ask, is anybody under the age of 18 in the class? We'll assume everybody present is an adult. There are some wonderful assortment of naughty badges. That is to say, things that contain genitals and or depict lewd acts. Medieval people had a fantastically lewd sense of humor, just as we do today. And in my opinion, recreating pewter is delightful in part because of that, because it's a way that the really sort of base common person's humor is captured in a permanent manner that we have in actual pewter form. Well, there's a wonderful assortment of things we can click on, human activity. I'll show you how to navigate through. So I've clicked on human activity. This would enable me to search. Perhaps I wanted to say swords or hoods or something that I'm looking for. But in this case, I'm just going to click on the little shell icon up here with the check. Check mark means they know where they found it. Question mark means they don't. But here's an assortment of humans being active. And here we're looking at an actual find. It's a man with a bow. He's 4.7 by 2.3 centimeters. You'll want to have your metric rulers handy when you're looking at these sources. They're European, they're in metric, which is actually very handy because they're very precise. When you're looking at it on the screen, they've always brought the picture up for you very nicely. How big that item is very relative, and frequently they are quite small. It is my personal experience that I do not recommend trying to take a complex complex badge and scaling it down to a smaller size. I will show you one later that I learned this the hard way. But if you're recreating an existing badge, go with their existing size or larger is a pretty wise guideline. You'll potentially find it very frustrating to scale down what they did previously. In this case, they don't have a country of origin. They know where they found it, from the Netherlands. They do think they give us a pretty narrow range of date, 1375 to 1424. This is awesome for when you're looking at the clothing, and that's frequently how they're dating it. Sometimes it's where they found it and what else they found around it is how they're dating it. Pretty much every pewter find that's ever been published is part of this database, including a lot of images of people wearing badges. Like, oh, we found a painting and there's a guy wearing a badge there. They included that in this database. And there's actually a lot of stones in the database as well. They haven't always been easy to find, but I have collected a folder of those images as I've found them hunting through. And I know that Mont Saint-Michel, which is still a pilgrimage site in France today, has a bunch of extant stones that have been used since the Middle Ages, and they still hold, that they still cast these pilgrimage badges from. There's a lot of things, of course, that we found that we don't know how they cast. And the Museum of London has some that I dream of someday getting to go and looking at to see how I think they put them together. And I'll talk a little bit about the more complex molded things in a minute. But the simple part of what we're looking at today is flat things like this. They may have a pin back behind them, but mostly it's a relief image. And that's the sort of thing that's easiest to cast, carved in stone. Why make stuff in pewter? Why bother with this art? It is worth doing when you want to make multiples, when you want to make a bunch of things. So frequently when I have taught this class as a hands-on class, I'll get somebody who comes in and is like, I'm going to make a ring for my partner because I love them so much. And I'll say, that's wonderful. And this is absolutely not the right class to do that in, because unless you want to make 20 rings and you have 20 partners, which is your choice, generally speaking, it's not really worth doing as carving stone. That's typically something you're going to make as a wax positive and have somebody cast in a higher temp metal. Not to say you can't go to the great deal of trouble to carve a stone to cast one ring for your beloved, or perhaps give your beloved many rings from that mold. But for many of us, the reason to cast in pewter is to make multiples. I'm going to pop my hat off now. The other thing to think about this is that just as they did in the Middle Ages, create these items as tokens that they had traveled to a certain place for a certain purpose. They are therefore the most ideal thing we could possibly create as site tokens in the SCA, because they are medieval things, they are things that are a joy to dress ourselves with and wear, and they show that we have been to a time and place in the same way that those items did in the Middle Ages. And we get so few chances for things to align so nicely for an SCA need and a period craft to come together so well. So that's my big advocacy for pewter. Also, because it's a really pretty cheap art to get into. You can cast melt pewter on your stove at home, on a camp stove. I've seen people use tuna fish cans on a camp stove. You can find stone for relatively cheap. The tools are relatively cheap. It isn't a high art. It is a base art. It is something that was practiced in trades and workrooms, but also was sometimes practiced on the sly and on the side, as we see from some of the naughty bits that we find as well. And that's why it's a fun thing to recreate. I see one person claiming adulthood, so I know chat's working. Thank you. Are there any questions before I go rolling forward? What's my favorite historical token? I have many. I have folders and folders full. But I will actually say I have a historical token that I own. And in fact, it is freestanding. Here we are. You may have seen the merchant Mark de Gockler, Gockler Medieval Wares. He is out of Canada, British Columbia, Curie, and he sells reproduction and original finds, and works with people in the UK who do metal detecting and things like that to find original finds. I saw this and dreamt about wanting it for more than 10 years before I finally purchased this from him at a September Crown a few years ago, and I do dream of recreating this. I believe that this is the base of what might be a taller figure. There's sort of legs visible, but not the whole figure, and baskets that are sort of full of fruit, sort of a harvest symbolic theme, and it is very, very thin and just wide enough to stand by itself, and the sort of thing one might see on a little altar, and something I hope to recreate someday. So I think that is my favorite historical badge, but I've recreated quite a few. So which of the ones I've made is a different question than what do I love that's historic. Is there any use of coins made of pewter? That is a better question for the Moneyers Guild, who will answer it. And I think that they do use pewter. I know that their striking techniques were how bezants have been made. Bezants are like little tiny pewter badges with a loop on them, very much like sequins or spangles. A way to have spangly dresses is to have bezants, and you can buy them from some of the pewter makers like Billy and Charlie. In general, pewter is softer than you want in coins. It bends pretty easily, and it rubs pretty easily. So I would say that from an actual hard currency standpoint, no. From a reproduction standpoint, yes, I certainly have seen recreated pewter coins and cast coins. And more often what we end up creating are things that have a hanging loop on them because we're creating tokens. So I have seen double-sided tokens in round like coins. What are ways to attach rather than the historical integrated pin? Yes, sewn on is the other historic way, loops or potentially riveted on. There are pewter and bronze essentially rivets where things are cast with the stem sticking out, and that stem is bent over, hammered over on the back of the leather or fabric that it's attached to. for our modern sensibility, what I have done is used modern pin backs and soldered them onto the back. Pewter is solder. It's very, very similar material. So it's fairly easy to solder onto. I'm a terrible solderer. I recommend having better skills than my own, but I have used that or used a metal glue like JB Weld to glue pin backs onto things. There are some other things you can do with pewter. I will show you. These are a set of leaves that I made into a livery collar for my Laurel elevation. I cast them in pewter and then I gold leafed them with inexpensive faux gold leaf. They have all worn off at the edges. I did not lacquer them. I didn't do anything to protect the gold leaf, and this is sort of the evidence that gold leafing is pretty delicate. But I did wear this for a number of years before that wear started to show. And this does have a, facing the wrong way, an enameled pewter badge at the center. Here we go. And would originally have had another badge hanging off of it that is currently removed because it's been worn in a couple places. These were connected to one another using a steel pin that was soldered onto the back. Like that. So there are some other ways to try to attach pewter. I would say that I don't think I've necessarily solved that. I certainly find that there is pewter made by some of the professionals that exceeds my own skill. And some of my fellow Pewterers Guilds members have done things that exceed my own skill. I have evolved one technique that I do think is worth noting that I'll get into when we talk about three-part molds. That's a way to include a loop as well as a pin back so that people can't hang a thing that has a pin. Is that a Schnecki of Schneckies? That is my arms. Indeed, it is a Schnecki maintaining 3 Schneckis on the outer whorl. There we go. So yes, it is a Schnecki of Schneckies. The language at the time when I registered it was maintaining. Thank you. Okay, good. Good questions. I'm gonna bounce back to my my list of what I'm supposed to talk about. What is pewter? What are extant finds? So I've talked about sort of what are extant finds directly and why we make these things. How are these things made is the next category. Practical considerations, making multiples, undercuts. We think, hey, we want to make some stuff in pewter. If we were teaching this class in a different time, I would have scheduled this as usually a 4-hour class, and we would have actual stones prepped and ready for you. So I apologize that this is an all talk and theoretical class, but the question of what do we do? The answer is we buy soapstone, we cut it into smaller blocks into the size of molds we want and cut those in half or into further pieces. We connect them with cast pewter register pins so that we can take those molds apart and put them back together tightly. Then we carve the space that pewter will flow into to cast the item we want. And then we cast those with molten pewter. All right, that's the short summary. It's a little more complicated than all that. I'm going to flip back to share screen to show you the Pewterers Guild webpage, which is made and maintained by Guillaume de Garrigue, also companion of Laurel. And that's the Pewterers Guild logo. When you see a spoon with a crown over it on the back of a token, that means it was made by the Pewterers Guild. The Pewterers Guild has not been an active organization for a long time. I would love to see it become an active organization, and all that means is people who are doing pewter stuff talking to each other and supporting each other and making it. We historically made site tokens, and so somebody would do the carving of the mold and getting it ready to cast, and then people would come together to help cast and finish the pieces, and we'd provide those for people holding events, particularly here in the barony of Madrone, but for other groups as well. And we taught classes and things like that. And that's why we have a webpage. Publications has our basic intro to pewter class. This was created by also Master Sean O'Connor, as well as Master Guillaume, and is a pretty excellent basic breakdown of what we do. I've talked to you a little bit about this. So we talked about something to melt the pewter. A little while, I'll show you my electric pewter melting pot. But as mentioned, it is something we can do over pewter. I have done over charcoal fires at demonstrations and so forth. And it's fun to cast over fire, but convenient to cast over electric pewter pots. The temperature control and cleanliness aspect. If there's no way I can really screen share and see chat at the same time. So I'm going to finish running through the handout here. Again, if we were having a physical class, I might have printed these out and handed these to you. Back in the old days, before we just provided everything digitally, but I will make sure you get the links to these web pages. This is pewtersguild.org, so you can find that again anytime. And a lot of the links are off of this page as well. Carving implements, saw, safety equipment. I'm going to get into that in a sec. I want to run through the rest of this handout before we jump back into safety equipment. Soapstone. Why we use soapstone, what kind of soapstone we want to pick. I particularly loved Italian green, Cascadian gray. Frequently we buy soapstone from sculpt.com. Recent years I haven't been able to get the same varieties from them we used to, and have most recently purchased from Artisan Craftsman Supply. Which is an art supply store in Seattle and a few other places, I think maybe in Portland. The soapstone that is used for soapstone countertops is too hard, and you don't want to try to use that for this purpose. Generally speaking, when you're looking for a soapstone that you think you want to cast, if you can scratch it with a hard fingernail or your key, that's going to work. If it doesn't scratch easily, it's not the thing you want, because we're going to be scratching it. That's how we're going to be carving it. There certainly are other stones. Extant molds are in sandstone and other materials. And in fact, there's a particular kind of stone called African Wonderstone that is particularly hard and particularly detailed. And I know that that's what Billy and Charlie use for most of their casting. I found it terribly difficult to work with. So people's experiences do vary, but there are some other kinds of stones that are used. But in general, we use soapstone. We use relatively soft soapstone. There is a danger of getting too soft, and particularly things that have inclusions in them can have those little rivers and lines and can cause the stone to break in those places, which can be really heartbreaking when you put a lot of labor into it. The good news is it is possible to repair broken stones. The material we use for that is RTV, room temperature vulcanization, comes in the form of engine gasket sealant tubes. Here we go. Gasket maker. These used to run about $5. I think this runs around $9 now on Amazon. Comes in black and red. You can basically use it as a glue to repair high temperature molds like stone molds. So that's one of our secret materials. Bonus tip. Okay, so that's why you want to avoid soapstone that has a lot of inclusions. They can make it harder to cut, and they can make it harder to carve, and they have the danger of breaking. So ideally, you find something that's a nice smooth grain, easy enough to carve, not too soft. A little bit of a mix. The dangers, things you can run into that are dangerous, include asbestos occurs naturally in some soapstone. No store will guarantee that they don't have asbestos in their stone. Generally speaking, buying from art supply stores is a better route than going out to that spot on the hill you know that has soapstone. However, if you have some way to test it, do. If you don't, wearing protection when you carve is a really good idea. You will create dust when you're carving. It's just the nature of the carving. And asbestosis is terrible. So it's important that you know all that. Cuttlebone. I have not tried cuttlebone. I know people who have. I hear it smells terrible. And cuttlebone doesn't last as long. One of the advantages of carving into stone is that stone molds last kind of forever. There's no limit on the number of things you can cast from stone molds. I've cast hundreds and even thousands out of certain molds that I have. So that's one of the reasons it's superior to rubber and to cuttlebone. But I do know that that is used in period, and people have. I have not myself. And I've known people have used plaster as well, but I have not myself as well. How hot is pewter? I think that I usually melt it to around 600 or 700 degrees, but I actually don't have a thermometer or a very accurate pot, so I wouldn't say that I know that for sure. It does not melt at 300 degrees because you can easily bake it in the oven with enamel on it, as I'll get into later. Have I ever cast from an extant period mold? No. I've never held an extant period mold. That would be amazing. Often what we see, they use like a paper mache type material to cast into the molds. I don't think I've ever seen any historians cast with hot pewter into historic molds, as exciting as that would be. No. Okay, so we talked about what soapstone to avoid, what soapstone to look for: African Wonderstone, Italian Green, Brazilian Gray, Cascading Gray, Sierra Hills. When I looked at sculpt.com this weekend, none of those names were listed. So your mileage may vary, but you are all over the kingdom and possibly all over the world, and you may find that there is other soapstone available near you. Artisan Craftsman Supply is actually linked off of there, as is sculpt.com. Those are the two places I just talked about. I already talked about buying pewter. Rio Grande was where Sean used to buy from. As I mentioned, Rotometals has been our go-to for now. I should also mention that Rotometals almost always runs a sale the week before a holiday. So before Memorial Day, before Labor Day. And when you order over $100 worth, you usually get free shipping. Really worthwhile on things that weigh as much as pewter. And so worth signing up for their email list. They only write you about sales, and it's good to know about them. Safety, we've talked about lead. I will say, I started to say it's a little bit about lead. Lead, as I said, it's not like it off gases. It's getting little tiny bits of it into your mouth that make people sick. And why people who live in homes with lead paint get sick is little flakes of paint come off and fall into things, and we eat them and rebreathe them. And why lead in pipes is dangerous is that if a chemical carries it out, it gets into our systems and we're eating it. Generally speaking, casting lead isn't dangerous. People cast lead bullets, and a lot of the casting equipment available is because of that. A lot of the casting places that we buy from are where people buy for casting for black powder and historic weaponry. However, the reasons cited to avoid lead are mostly our later filing and handling of things, and the subsequent likelihood of a pewter token getting put in the mouth of a child, because children are like that, and adults when they're drunk. So just avoid pewter with lead in it if we can, and keep your lead projects in their own category. I do hear that lead flows differently, and that some things might have been easier to cast because they were using pewter with lead in it. Have not personally put myself through that experience. Don't recommend that anybody else does necessarily as well. So one of the great things about this handout is it explains to us how we cut the molds in half and cut them into smaller pieces. I use usually a bandsaw to do this. I have done this with a hand saw. It is easier with bandsaw, which does the same thing that handsaw does. It moves the blade in a direction. In fact, I think there is some advantage to the bandsaw in that it leaves me with a series of even grooves that actually help the stones fit really nicely together. Some people do cut by hand and then smooth with sandpaper or like a brick or a rough stone, knowing that sandpaper is not really period exactly, and make things fit together that way. There's more than one way to handle your stone. However, the bandsaw method has been very convenient for me, especially when I'm producing 10 molds for a class or something like that. You do lose some stone when you cut, so you want to plan for that. How big, how thick, I'll pick up some stones in a minute to show you what we're talking about. Certainly, this is something you can do with a hacksaw or a wood cutting blade. However, a lot of wood cutting blades, the teeth kick out further and you lose a lot more stone. A blade that is more like a metal cutting blade is usually what we use on the bandsaw, has teeth that are more in line, and you'll lose less, and those finer teeth do a better job of cutting the stone. You will sometimes encounter inclusions in the stone when you're cutting, and sparks can shoot off. Always wear eye protection when cutting on power tools. I'll get into safety equipment a little bit more later, but eye protection is a really good idea, especially when using a bandsaw. I'll get into mold size a little bit when I show you some examples of what we're talking about. But the first thing to keep in mind is that you need room for your item that you're casting and for a sprue, that is the funnel that the pewter flows into. So I'm going to get into that in a moment. There's a little layout drawing coming down here. You cut the block, they've cut it in half. This is getting into how we drill the register pins. This is another thing you can do by hand. It is super convenient with a drill press. And that's how I typically do that. You do have to be careful because typically what we'll do is we'll cut the stone and then tape it with masking tape back together and then drill the holes. That double wrap of masking tape can cause the stone to rock a little bit, and then your holes go in slightly at an angle instead of straight in. This can be a problem when you try to take the mold apart. It'll actually break the stone. I've actually done this. So add little levels to make sure that when you're drilling with the drill press, your drills for the register your pins for the register pins go through completely straight. Typically, we're going through one side of the mold and part of the way into another. I'm going to show you these in a second. I should just grab them and stop saying I'm about to show. So the question is, how big are they? This is the smallest mold I have in terms of thickness. It's a little more than a ½ inch thick total, and each slab is a little more than a ¼ inch thick. Probably about 2.5 by 1.5 inches. And it casts a snowflake-shaped badge that is actually a token used by Gemma when she was princess. This was actually a stone that I cut down from another one. So this is about as small as I ever make them. I don't make them this small for most people. And one of the reasons is, as I talked about with those inclusions, it's easier to break a thin mold. It's a lot harder to break a big one. There's some mixed cost benefits about your size, because how well your stone casts can have to do with how warm it is, and it is easier to heat up a smaller stone. Some of my stones are pretty massive and they can take a long time to heat up. I do that usually by casting over and over again, but this mold is, I think, the biggest one I have in the box, and it's because I don't have my axe head mold with me, but I do cast a small pewter axe head. This one, the slabs are each more than ½ inch thick. So it's over 1 inch thick overall, and it's probably 3.5 inches by 2 inches at the large part. And that is the mold that I used to cast that large badge with my arms on it. One of my duties as Baroness is to have my sergeantry have badges on their baldric from each Baroness that they've served. And most of them were much larger because they were done in embroidery. And of course, I wanted to do mine in pewter. And so this is pretty big for pewter, but was still a little smaller than the other Baroness's badges. This is, however, a good example to show you what I'm talking about with these register pins. These are pretty big pins that I've put here. In this mold, I have 2 that are big and 2 that sort of barely cast, but the 2 big ones were enough to easily hold the mold together because it's just a 2-part mold. And you can see this little bit of black stuff on the edge there. That was RTV. That was some engine gasket sealant I used to repair where the corner of that mold broke initially, and I was able to repair it where the register pin hit. This is my first mold ever. I took a class that Sean taught in pewter casting, and I lucked out extraordinarily, and this went extraordinarily well, and that's why I'm still talking about this like 15 years or 20 years later. It's been a while. Casts a pomegranate, which was a particularly convenient shape in that it has lines that the pewter flows through easily, dots that are fun to carve. I'll show you some tools that are tricky for carving dots. And it's a pretty thick little mold. It didn't need a huge sprue. It probably had some natural air venting from some fissures in the stone. These halves are approximately a ½ inch thick. It's actually somewhat unevenly cut, and 1.25 inches by less than 2 inches. They vary pretty widely in size, but they're all, I tend to say they're smaller than a cigarette pack or around the size of an Altoids tin. Most of my molds sizes. Some of them are tiny just because they cast something that's much smaller. Buttons particularly I have smaller molds for. And some of them are larger because I cast larger things with them. This is, so 3-part molds. Why do you do 3-part molds? I've been screen sharing, and so I don't know how much everybody's been seeing my little tiny pictures. I'm sorry. what I scrolled past here was a fairly detailed explanation of how to cast register pins, which is totally useful, but we're not going to spend a lot of time here on. Absolutely the sort of thing I would give you more advice on if you go to start creating your own mold for casting. As I said, usually when we teach a class, we try to have those prepped for you so that we can sort of hasten past that. Here is the important lesson about placement. Very frequently, when somebody goes to cast their first item, they carve right in the middle of their stone. And it's useful to, in fact, carve lower on your stone, leaving room for the sprue. I'll get into how we carve our design. Here's what we talk about cutting the sprue. Generally speaking, you want the volume of pewter in that sprue to be equal to the volume of pewter in the item you're casting. So the bigger item you have, the more sprue you're going to need. And in fact, there's some ways to have sort of multiple sprues come together, and I'll show you some examples of those in a little bit. This is a very useful side view of what the inside of a two-part mold looks like. You can see the thin sort of disc of the item and the large sprue area. Also in this view, you can see how the register pin is outside the area of the sprue and the item. And that's some of what you're thinking about as you're selecting where you're putting your register pins and where you're carving your items, so that they don't get too close together. This is pretty close together. With a two-part mold, usually you can get by with just 2 register pins. When we get into multiple parts, often we add more register pins. Some people choose to use clamps or other methods to hold their stones together. Definitely find that register pins are the most useful way to go. We do see examples of them in some of the period stones. Mostly it's rapidness in casting is one of the big reasons that I favor register pins. The handout continues to talk about attempting your first cast and troubleshooting, and I'm actually going to get into probably that when I show you some casting in a little bit. Venting lines and cross-hatching. This is a wonderful lesson. When I first read one of the Museum of London books on dress accessories, they had a pewter button, and they described it as having radiant lines on the back and saying they didn't know why those were there. I went to Mark and I was like, what do you mean they didn't know? Didn't they ask anybody who cast? And he said, well, it was one of their early books. They hadn't figured as much out yet then. Of course, it had radiant lines on the back. Those are flow lines. When you're casting pewter, the pewter has to enter the mold and the air has to exit the mold. And the pewter is really hot, and the air is also becomes very hot and expands. This is a tricky little thing we play with. I'm going to jump into safety mode here for a moment. This is why it's extremely important that you never, ever get moisture on a mold that you're going to be casting with. And one of the primary ways we might do that is if we blow the dust off the mold. Little tiny flecks of moisture come out of our mouths, which we talk about so much more in 2020 than we used to, but this used to be a really somewhat illuminating bit of safety culture that we had to explain. This actually happened to Sean, where he cast and one of those little tiny dots of moisture was in, and it immediately becomes a super expanded bubble, and it blows the pewter back out the mold at you. Sean was really lucky and was wearing adequate safety protection, was far enough back that that blowback didn't cause him to lose an eye or have major burns on his face, but it could. So I'm being really heavy-handed in this safety lecture because this is seriously a way that molten pewter could hurt you really badly, and we really don't want it to. So never, ever, ever blow on your stone. Never cast where drops of water might be getting on your stone. Keep your stone dry. Keep little bits of moisture from getting in there. So venting. That's connected to the same pressures letting the air in and out. So we add vent lines to help the pewter flow in and to help the air flow out. And there's this little tricky level where you're trying to get enough flow lines to make the pewter go where you want, and not so much that it goes out into your venting lines and creates little hairs that you have to trim off later when you cast. However, adding vent lines, sometimes they happen naturally, sometimes they happen from the scoring of the saw. Sometimes we're adding them by carving lines across the stone, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. Frequently helps your casting work better. It's one of the tricks. It's one of our problem-solving techniques. And it's why you see lines on the backs of cast items, like cast buttons, historically as well. Right. And we had a Yahoo group way back when. I think Yahoo groups are gone. There is a Pewters Guild Facebook group. It hasn't been active for some time, but there are some Pewters in other parts of the country and the world, in England and other places, who are active on that. That's true. We don't use vitreous enamel, as Furley said. I'm looking at the comments now. Thank you. Which is much hotter. It's true. We use porcelain, which is enamel paint. In fact, that's one of the links that I have lined up to show us, is to talk about paint on pewter. There are some indications that extant items may have included, going back to paint on them. Most enamels will work on pewter, things that are designed to paint on metal. But we have found that low fire enamels, such are used for glass and metal work, are particularly useful. I actually was worried that this product wasn't available anymore. It's because Michael stopped carrying it, but Dick Blick still does. Porcelain is an enamel that you paint on and then you bake in the oven, and it helps the paint stay on the pewter a lot better. I have it. I don't know if you can see this. It'll be very small. If I go into full screen. There we go. This is a Billy and Charlie enameled item. They painted in the red bud and leaves in green. Also, the Madrone Award of the Green Leaf is done as a painted pewter leaf. Like this. We can get a certain level of opacity with the porcelain paints that resembles the effect of vitreous enamel on other metals. So it is a way for us to cheaply cheat and attempt to get the appearance of finer made enameled items. I wouldn't say that that is high art, but it is one of the things that we can get away with in pewter. What if you do it before cutting it in half? Well, it's important that you get them to line up again later. So yes, you could do it either way. I guess I would be worried they'd shatter. I just haven't tried it. It's a good thought. Good what if question. Yeah, the question about pewter and its resemblance to other cheap things. Pot metal is generally the large category that we can describe in that, and zinc is one of the things that a lot of stuff that we think of as being pewter is actually made from, and it behaves very differently and is not what we're going to be casting. So you're right in that there's some things that we call pewter or pewter colored in our head that aren't necessarily pewter. Release agents like silicone spray. I don't use silicone spray. When you want to use something like a powder or release agent, what we have used is graphite powder. You can buy it at hobby shops. It's used for derby car Boy Scouts to balsa wood derby car racing. They use the graphite to make the wheels go faster. That's where I've been able to find it. I tried to find my tube of it to show you guys today, and I don't have one now. I used to have a shared pewter casting equipment set with my best friend, Donya Temekin, but she owns her own house now and has room for all the pewter casting. So a lot of the equipment that we used to share went to her, and my casting equipment was a little more sparse than it used to be. But anyway, for powder, some folks have also used really the powder that's left from their stone as a release powder as well, and have found that as a way to break the surface tension and cause the pewter casting to behave differently, that stone powder has worked for them. I have not personally found that to work well, but I wouldn't say that I've played with it a lot either. We've talked a little bit about prepping stones, and so I'm going to switch to showing you some stones and some stuff that I've cast, and then we can move on to... We started mostly talking about two-part molds, that is, molds that fit together with just two parts of them. This is another one that's fairly thin. That's my my leaf mold there for that green leaf or the laurel leaves. There we go. How's that? So on this one, you can see I definitely did those feathered lines of venting. This is item that I designed based on several different items rather than a single item. It casts not exactly disc, a sort of octagonal shaped item with 2 loops. And if you look really closely, you see that black dot. That's where I've used RTV to repair where a little tiny piece of stone broke away. One of the most dangerous places to break stone are those little tiny dots of stone that are left in the middle of a loop that you carve. And undercuts are a terrible danger in casting. So let me pause for a minute to talk about undercuts, and I apologize that we didn't have an undercut image in the handout that we used. Got a cast item here. I'm going to pull up its stone to show you. This is actually African Wonderstone. This is my complicated little knight with a swinging shield. But this shows you what the pewter looks like in the mold, with the mold open. This sprue fans out into 4 points to flow pewter into this complicated shape. And it actually is designed to allow the pewter to flow out the bottom a little bit, which it does. It's a little nub sticking out there. And it's mostly flat. It does stick out onto this surface a little bit. This is that other surface. You can see where those sprues stick down and where there's just a little bit of detail down at the bottom there. My arm's signature, the Pewter's Guild signature, and a lot of hash marks. When the pewter is in this half of the mold, and I go to lift it out, every edge that the pewter has flown into has to be smooth in a way that the pewter would not lift and grab the stone. And that's what we call undercuts. I really apologize that I don't have a good illustration. This is something we usually show you on a whiteboard or something like that. But essentially, if you allow your cuts or your carving to go into the edges of your stone in a way that the pewter can flow under an edge of stone, when you go to lift it out of the mold, it's going to break that little edge of stone away. This is really problematic, and one of the reasons why we select a lot of the tools we use for carving, and one of the big dangers to look out for in carving. And it's one of the reasons why we're limited into what we can cast in stone. And some of the things that I mentioned that you see cast modernly in pewter are really complicated in ways that they can do because they have a rubber mold that bends away. And so those undercuts just aren't a problem for them in the way they are for us. And so that's a lot of the limiting factor of what can be done in pewter. And what makes some of the really complicated pewter items made by Billy and Charlie and some of the master pewters really impressive is how they combat those challenges. But that's a significant challenge we face in pewter casting. So we talked about 2-part molds. The other kind of molds are 3-part molds, and those are when we want there to be another plane. There are, of course, molds with more parts, but most of mine are 2- and 3-part molds. Most of the time, that second plane is desired for the purpose of a pin back or a button back. This is a mold. This forms a bowl full of spoons, and it forms a pin back. There we go. You can see that line that casts up into there is the pin part that stabs into things. Smaller one. Oh, there we go. A little easier to see. This one is actually a little bit easier to see because it's all fixed with RTV. Will it show in this light? This is for my windmill, and we were under a time crunch, so rather than carve a new back, which would have been the artistically correct or historically correct method, I chose to fix it with RTV. But it's a really pretty brilliant little windmill that actually turns. There's 2 pieces put together, so the sacrifice was worth it. I mentioned earlier that there is a way to do a pin back with a loop. This is actually another Madrone award. This is a Study Madrone award. So there's the stone. You can see it with the pewter in it, and you can see how it has this separating line, like so. Those 2 parts come apart. And so you can see the sprue and the pin and that tab, which is sort of the thing that locks the pin in place. You can see all the fuzzy bits of pewter sticking out there that are going to have to get trimmed away. That's where the pewter has flowed into vent lines that have been created either intentionally or unintentionally in the stone. But I added that loop at the top of the pin back, and that enables the item to be strung from a cord as well as pinned onto a hat or garment. Since the pin is more damaging to garments, and of course the pin has a limited number of times it likes to be bent back and forth, having the loop to sew or secure with, you can secure with a safety pin or something like that, is another option. And I totally recommend, if you have space, doing your pin backs with a loop as well, if it's something that can be hung from where that pin back is. It's a nice way to expand the options. This item obviously is a little bit complicated in that it has loops, double holes on each of the three corners. One of the goals of the Sveti Madrone is that it's an award that can be given multiple times, and there's different beads for different arts. And so it had to have a lot of loops. This mold, like some of the others I've mentioned, has RTV repairs to some of those loopholes where I created an undercut when I was carving and had to repair my little dots. I did manage to get the ones at the bottom without needing to repair them, so I can gloat about that. But there's a lot of humility, I hope, in what you're hearing from me, which is to say, the nice thing about pewter carving is that you can, we're all adults here, you can fuck it up and still proceed and get the thing done and cast the beautiful thing. And I, for one, am a big fan of things that can survive us fucking it up. Please don't hurt yourself, but otherwise, feel free to fuck some stuff up on the way. It'll work out well in the end. Okay. I could show you a whole bunch more molds. I don't know how fruitful that would be. Thought I might move on to casting, and I should take a look at my outlines and take a look if there are more questions. Carving tools. That is a good thing for me to talk about before we talk about casting. Okay. And then I'll talk a little bit, I have some other links I can send you all at the end. Things I included in my other links are some people who create pewter commercially. Billy and Charlie's are the most famous among them. Their work is amazing. And I will tell you honestly that I really tried hard not to look at it for like the first dozen or so years I was pewter casting. Don't hold yourself against their level, please. Compare yourself to my stuff. It's much better crap. In the sense that it is crap, and we shouldn't all try to be quite as fabulous as Billy and Charlie are. Not that we shouldn't be that great, but don't hold your work in low regard if it isn't as great as theirs. They're supernaturally talented. They're amazing workmanship. Their reproductions are amazing and entirely worth the money. Go ahead and look at them, but don't give yourself a hard time about them. And I do suspect that we have some of the same choice. We have reproduced a bunch of the same items, and it always feels a little odd. I feel okay about my pieces, but I don't really like to compare to theirs. But they're one of the people to look at as our Feathered Cock Pewter, Not a Pixie Press, which is Temekin's Etsy store, is another place that I have listed on my links page. She has a lot of the naughty pewter. She is more the pewter pornographer than I am. I am famous for talking up the pewter pornography. You could arguably call me the pewter pimp. I have only done one pornographic pewter badge, except for the Pizzled Boar, which is he's just natural. He's not really pornographic. So it's useful and inspirational to look at other people's work, but can also make you hard on yourself when you're starting out in a way that I don't recommend. So also look at people's early work. I have some examples that I would normally hand around of other people's castings. Don't compare yourself to the people who've made spoons. Spoons are super duper complicated. But a lot of us, our first casts are, simpler things. Little heart-shaped badges. It's a nice badge. This is probably somebody's fourth cast, I think. This gal is not playing currently. So look at what other people do, but don't be too hard on yourself. That's the upshot of that little bit of information I'm going to share. There's also a number of videos that have been made by Morgan Donner of Morgan Donner Sewing Party, also a companion to Laurel and a Madrone person, about pewter casting. And they're on YouTube. Again, I'll include those on the list of links I have to share with you. Another useful resource for somebody talking about what we're talking about here and seeing what other people do. Does Red Wolf cast his own stuff? I think the pewter casting that Red Wolf sells are cast with modern machines or techniques. I don't know for sure, and you should ask him, but I have never been under the impression that he was a carver of stone for his casting. Speaking of carving of stone, I'm going to set down my heavy box of stones and talk about tools. What do we carve with? When I was looking for my tools and materials to share with you folks, I also found my boxes of tools that I had for classes, and it was interesting to note what I have to share for classes, which has come down to mostly pencils and a few filing tools and some chisels and things that I used to use more and don't as often now. Dental tools. Nearly everybody thinks that a dental tool might be a useful carving tool. And the vast majority of pewter carvers that I know now have tried and rejected dental tools completely. They just don't seem to scratch in the right direction. I can't explain any better than that, but go ahead and try them. But almost everybody I know has been disappointed by them. I've bought a lot of mini chisel sets over the years. It's mostly really hard to get them small enough. This is a little less than a 1/4 inch across, and that's broader than I often need. So I find I haven't used them very often. Most of them are a little bigger than I needed. That being said, when you need to clear a lot of area, something like a chisel can be a really useful item. Yes, in fact, I actually have tools that I have just to sell people when I teach classes. Really not very useful while you're all far and away, but we'll get into those in a minute. Things that you can find at Harbor Freight Tools. So, I'm going to try. I was trying to show my box of pewter tools. It's egregiously modern. It's a yellow submarine. But it's what I have found is most useful for me to carry around stuff. I have a big pile of pewters, guild cards. They're beautifully letterpressed, also by Doña Temecan. The other stuff in my box includes a circle template. Circle templates, super useful. You mostly use them for drawing. Sometimes you can even carve against them. They're pretty thin, so mostly you use them for drawing. But being able to repeat your circle and get your circle sizes exact, very, very useful. Generally speaking, when you're planning on a button size, carve for a slightly smaller size because you're going to end up working it out a little larger as you work. Start a little smaller. There are oval and other shaped templates as well. Most of mine are circular. Other things in my pewter box are a whole bunch of silver jump rings. That's for attaching pewter things to for people later. In that case, I usually have a pair of bent nose pliers that are flat. A lot of my pewter handling equipment is actually finishing equipment for trimming and filing after I've cast things. These little tiny inexpensive clippers, oh my God, these used to be so cheap. They were like $2.50 each back in the day. They're not quite that cheap anymore, but they're still pretty cheap. They're really useful. It's one of the great things about pewter is it cuts really easily. You don't need a really sharp or really powerful tool to cut it. But for cutting off sprues and little extra bits of casting, they're very useful. Also have a set of round nose pliers for bending certain things in pewter. Those tabs on the back of pins are bent with round nose pliers, and the tabs that are part of the patterns get bent with those pliers as well. I also have a lot of needle files for filing the rough edges on pewter where you've cut and where you've filed bits away in casting. Particularly in love with the half round. It's sort of spade shaped, and in profile it's flat on one side and just slightly rounded. It's absolutely my favorite. It's really the most useful. Needle files are really cheap. I am told that we want to be careful that the tools that you use for pewter are not tools that you hope to later use for silver or more pure jewelry making. So make sure that the tools you're using for pewter are ones that you can junk up with pewter and not anger somebody in your life who maybe wants those special jewelry tools for more fine jewelry than what we're doing. Also in my pewter carving equipment are sometimes old toothbrushes. This is a fantastic little travel toothbrush from the Alsace region that my sister brought me. I'm a great fan of tacky souvenir equipment. This is a part of my pewter carving equipment as well, and it contains a box that I use for collecting stone dust when I'm carving other places, so I can brush it into a container that I can dispose of myself. It's important usually that you put any dust you're tossing into a tied bagged container. You're not allowed to even throw loose dust in your trash can. Also in this bag I have dust masks. Again, things that we didn't all have around quite so much before 2020. For casting, and definitely when I'm cutting stone on the bandsaws and drilling on the drill presses, I definitely wear masks. Some people choose to wear them when they carve all the time, and I definitely respect that choice. Dust does come up when you use it. In the safety equipment bag includes my fancy larger brush for brushing off the stone from casting. Like I talked about before, you never want to be in the habit of blowing stone off your, the little dusts of stone off your stone. Use brushes. So this is a simple kind of paintbrush as a useful tool for that. Larger circle template. Safety goggles. All cutting, all drilling, and all casting should be done with safety goggles. I have actually gotten pewter on this part of my eyelid casting without safety goggles. I was really, really, really lucky. Don't be stupid like me and learn from my mistake before you make it. Always wear eyeglasses or some kind of safety protection. Pewter can splash, and it does, and our eyes are worth saving, and eye protection is cheap. And sometimes it even, the yellow kind can actually improve your vision in low light. These are actually ones that I use for bicycling, and they'll work as well. Always worth your effort. Thank you for enduring the safety lectures. It's an important part of this, how not to kill yourself or hurt yourself while you work. Okay. Having covered the safety equipment, what else is in my box is several stones that are in the work, and several pewter bits, and several pin vices holding other things. So this is one pin vice holding a diamond bit that is a rough metal bit that is used with a Dremel type tool. And this is a similar type of pin vise. This is one that might have been used to hold a needle file or similar tool. It's hard to get them with adequately small collets for these tools. Sometimes a trick to find. I have found them at bead stores for wire end rounders are set up this way, and you can take the wire end rounder bit out and put other bits in. I've also found some at Hardwick's, which was the best tool store in the world and just closed in Seattle and is going to be reopening in Idaho and exists online, but not a store you can walk into anymore, much to our grief. But pin vices, super useful. And the other things that I have put in pin vices include little tiny, and I do mean tiny, these are Dremel bits with burr ends. Those little dots of beading on the edge of certain tokens. Looking for one to show you. Here we go. See how this token has all these little dots around the edges of the pewter. I'll show you for scale what we're talking about. That's how big this whole token is. Those little tiny dots are made by making little perfectly round holes that aren't undercut in the stone. And burr bits like this and burr bits, they're sharp all the way around for Dremels, are two of the tools I've used to do that with. This is often the type of thing that these tools come with. There are various types of sharpness to them. One thing I really like about using these burr type bits is that a lot of them are round all the way around in a way that makes carving without creating those undercuts really easy. Because you can carve along the edge with something that is curved up that way that doesn't have the risk of hooking down under that edge. I wish I had a better way to physically explain this, but it's super useful. Very useful carving tool. Not all of my pieces are really modern. Some of my carving tools are pretty primitive. This is made from a piece of brass rod stock that I ground. This end I ground into a little file chisel. And the other end I then hammered on an anvil. And I created a very slightly spooned, spade-shaped bit. It's one of my favorite carving tools of all time. Now, it's hard to use because it doesn't have a lot of handle to grab. You can make your own brass tools, buy brass rod stock inexpensively, and like I said, hammer on something hard. Use a grinder if you have access to one. If you did that with the rod able to go into a handle of some kind, that would be easier on your hand working than this is holding this small rod when I work. It's quite bent from the work of my hand bending it. However, I still adore it and use it all the time. I've played a lot with making different tools over the years. I have one of these brass chisels that I carved into the end of the, there we go, into the end of the chisel. I don't know if you can see that. There's a little tiny V in the end of the chisel. That was done by filing or using a saw right into the end. And that was to create the circle and dot motif that you see in a lot of carving, where you see a circle around a dot. You get one edge of that V in the hole and you spin around and the other point creates the circle around it. That's why circle dot is a technique you see in clay decoration and basic carving. It's a pretty basic tool that's easily made and a detail that we see on a lot of things. Several of my pieces have circle dot things that needed that particular tool to make them. One tool that a lot of us have liked over the years, Sean used to give this to guild members, is a Twisted Scribe. It's a steel tool that has a very, very sharp point. I think it's probably used for engraving or engraving printing. It is an actually pretty handy tool. It's got a good weight and is easy to hold, and is often how I sort of sketch onto the stone as a first step. Sounds like Seahawks one. I hear fireworks. One tool that I've only recently come across are some rasps with this curve to them. I have found for removing a lot of stone pretty rapidly, they work really well, especially when you're trying to dish out the area that you're going to fill in with a bunch more. Those were also relatively inexpensive in the needle file section of tool and hardware stores. This was a pin set. It was a straight tool that I took a grinder to its round end to make into a very, very slightly sharpened angled cut. That enables me to carve straight lines very, very nicely. So it was a way to basically custom make a little tiny chisel, again, with a handle that I could hold a little bit better. And a lot of the line detail that you'll see on items that I've cast comes from that. One item that we frequently have in our carving tools is a kneaded rubber eraser. This is a way to test what you're carving when you can't cast. You can soften up your kneaded rubber eraser. This one's gone quite hard. It's been in my box for a long time. Sometimes I'll stick them on the lamp if I'm using a swing arm lamp and let the heat of the light bulb heat it up a little bit, makes it a little softer and easier to use. But you can push it into the mold and then lift it out again to see what your carving is looking like. An important moment while we talk about that pushing in and revealing. When you're carving in soapstone, you're carving in reverse. So anything you write has to be written backwards so that when it comes out, it will be read forwards. This is not intuitive. However, you can kind of cheat with our modern access to paper. If you write it really strongly so that it pushes through to the other side, you can turn over and use that other side as your guideline for carving and writing on the stone. But definitely take your time with any writing you do to get that corrected. This also comes up with things like badges, like the populace badge. Which direction is it supposed to face? You want to make sure that when you're carving and when you're designing for carving, that you have that facing in that other direction. I apologize. I am rambling a long time. We're already at 8:30, so I'll try to get moving a little bit faster. I apologize. Pencils, rulers, sandpaper bits, popsicle sticks. Other things that are in my carving box. Popsicle stick is a super handy, lightweight, straight edge that fits on your stone. Really great for cutting your vent lines. Really great for something to steady your hand against. Super useful tool. Cheap. I've also used bone tools. This was a bone tool that was sharpened. A lot of soapstone is soft enough that you can use bone as a carving tool, and I know other people who have as well. And as mentioned before, small rulers that have metric on them, super useful for carving kit. Pencils, mechanical pencils. I saw Phil mentioned that he uses mechanical pencil to hold very tiny tools. Pencil sharpeners, also usually in the toolkit. One of the other things in my toolkit is a wind-up timer. This little fellow, he's very cute. He's obnoxiously loud. This is because I have found that I only let myself carve for 15 minutes at a time. If I go longer, my body seizes up really badly. So for your own health and safety, it's a good idea to have some function that keeps you from hyper-focusing and carving for too long. Set a timer if you need to. People with children generally don't have trouble being uninterrupted for 15 minutes, but it's a problem I face. Okay, I'm going to carry us into where we have some pewter molten in another room so that we can have a little bit view of casting. I'm going to grab my easiest to cast stone. Magical through the kitchen. If I hold it up high enough, you can't see the dirty dishes. Okay. Oh. Okay. Not bad. Not perfect, but all right. So we've talked about casting and we've talked about safety. I'm gonna run back to the other room and grab my hair tie and pull my hair out of my way. Now with ponytail holder. And as I was heavy-handedly telling everyone earlier, eye protection. I also do actually button up my shirt necklines all the way. I have a scar on my chest that shows pretty well when I'm wearing a kirtle from casting in a tank top and then ignoring, well, I kept casting and not putting ice on it right away. Molten pewter is hot. This is also why I'm wearing natural linen clothes. Wear cotton or linen or wool, but synthetic clothing can melt at high temperatures and you don't want that molten plastic clothing sticking to your skin. So please, please. Even when I cast during the summer, I usually wear a lightweight cotton shirt buttoned up and lightweight cotton pants so that I can't splash onto my feet. I'm actually wearing closed-toe leather shoes for the same reason. Something can happen and the pewter pot knocks over, or the ladleful knocks over, and you're just going to be a lot happier if you're not getting that on your skin or on something that can melt. I'm using actually the top of my dryer, which is a handy metal surface that I have in my home, And I also have cookie sheets as added barriers for safety and some things to catch. Often I'll use a metal trivet as well, but I don't have to in this case. What I'm using for casting is a leather glove, so like a leather gardening glove. It's a heavy leather one. And then I have a second glove that goes over that. And I do want to roll my sleeve down a little further so that it sticks into there. The second glove is a fire glove. It's insulated in the hand, and this is an added layer of insulation. The reason why we're using double gloves on, in this case, for me, my left hand, it's going to make sense in a second, but lots of molten metal goes over this glove. They hold up pretty well. I've used these gloves for more than 10 years. For my right hand, in my case, is my dominant hand, I'm just going to have the leather gloves singly. This gives me a little bit more freedom and a little bit more movement. Okay. We were looking at the pewter pot. I'm going to actually move the camera over here and show you. Looks dark gray on top of this little pewter pot. Now, I've had a couple different pewter pots over the years. This one is brilliantly small. It heats up quickly, and it works really well for smaller casting. So this is all that dark stuff coming off as slag. What it is it's oxidization that's happening on top of the pewter. And the pewter has now turned very rapidly a sort of gold and pink color. It's oxidizing very quickly, which tells me that right now my pot is really pretty hot. As I mentioned, when we're talking about temperature, these are not necessarily accurately set pots. They don't necessarily have a very accurate temperature setting, but we do the best we can. And so reading that color of the pewter and how quickly it's oxidizing as you clear it is a lot of the information you come to have as you're casting with the pewter. And certainly when you're casting over fire and in more primitive circumstances where you have a lot less knowledge of what temperature setting or anything like that you have, what the pewter looks like is a lot of what you know. And then how does it behave? The nice thing about pewter is that it cools so quickly, we can cast rapidly and do sort of multiple casts. It's usually what we do to heat up a stone. This is a stone that historically has cast really very easily. So I'm dipping my ladle in. If I'm using a heavy cast iron ladle, I'll actually set it in the pot for a little while and let it heat up. So I poured a little bit of pewter in. I actually have left it sitting on top of the stone as well. And I'm going to let that pour off if there's some extra. Since that was my first one, it all settled on there. And we open it up. There we have one cast pomegranate. So I did cheat, as I mentioned, by grabbing the stone that I know reliably casts on the first try every time. Most of the time, it doesn't work that way. Much of the time, I cast 10 or 20 times and maybe get one that successfully casts. This is particularly frustratingly true of some of the more complicated pieces I've cast. This was a quick way to guarantee that I could show you what pewter casting does, how we work, physically do it, but don't expect that level of success the first time you cast. It doesn't generally happen that way. A few things about pewter casting and the specifics of the demonstration. You don't want to get molten pewter on your register pins. It'll build up pewter and it can actually melt out your register pins eventually. You can see where I have a little bit of slag on this one. So usually I place the side of the mold that has the pin heads with my fingers covering it on the mold casting hand. In the event that I do spill pewter out, I'm going to do this deliberately here for you guys. You can see it just sort of runs over the glove. I usually try to flick it out and runs over the top there, and I've just bent that off. Protection from that excess of pewter and from the increasingly hot temperature of the stone is why we have the double glove and the fire glove on this hand. There we go, got a nice impartial cast. As you're casting, you can, of course, add the items that didn't cast successfully back to the pot. They melt right back in. They do bring oxide with them. And if you're adding a lot of things back to the pot, it can change the temperature, and you may need to wait for that to reset before you cast more. I also find that environmental factors like humidity can make a big difference in how well things cast on any given day. I find that a lot of my stuff casts better on days when it's raining than it does on days when it's dry. There's a lot of factors we don't necessarily know or understand. The other equipment that I have here is a ingot mold. It's a way to pour your pewter out into smaller pieces to let them cool. So it's something I do usually when I need to pack up a pewter pot more rapidly, because it takes a long time for the whole piece of pewter inside here to cool again. And it's a way that you can do that when you're changing alloys in your pot and things like that. And then you have also smaller ingots that you can add piecemeal to the pot when you need to add a little more pewter. Instead of taking one of those 1 pound bars and sticking it in here, you can add in little pieces. That's the reason for having an ingot mold. This is a pretty small ladle. I have worked with larger ones as well. I find that for most tokens, actually, the small one is just fine. It heats rapidly. It can be damaged by being left in the pot. You see that lovely black burn mark on the side where it's been leaned on the edge of a larger pot than this one. Things that you can use over campfire that I have here include, this is a large ladle that I found in the used tool section at Hardwick's, but it has a nice spout tip to it. And for something like that, you would heat the pewter directly and pour it into the mold. As I said, I feel like that would be pretty hard to manage from a repeat standpoint, especially if you have a mold that likes to cast hot. This is the type of equipment that we use for casting on fire. It's a small cast iron bowl. You can buy these from like Lodge Cookware. They use them as like butter melters. They work great for melting pewter as well. Other tool that I had in here to show off is a blower tool. This one actually has a nicely flared end at one end, tapered at the other end, a hook. But when you're casting over fire with charcoal, you frequently need to get the area you want a lot hotter, and being able to blow directly onto it safely with a tool like this is a huge asset. Also, if you have to do a live fire demo casting pewter, I strongly recommend setting up, if at all possible, next to Grendel or another blacksmith, and having them melt your pewter on their much hotter forge for you so that your pewter is pre-melted. Pro tip, works great. We'll look at chat and see if there's any questions. Does preheating the stone help? Yes, I think it can. I have read that some people have used ovens to preheat theirs. This particular pot doesn't as radically. This has about a ½ inch between the pot and the base that it's suspended from. My other one had more like 2 inches, and I would keep my molds underneath up against that heating element on the underside to pre-warm them. So yes, preheating the stone does help. And literally, I've actually, in a pinch, trying to heat my mold up really quickly, taken the non-register pin side and dipped it into a pot of pewter to heat it up. I think that could be really dangerous and lead to a stone breaking, so I probably shouldn't recommend trying it, but I have done it successfully. So your mileage might vary. I don't think it's a Longenberger basket. It's a cheap knockoff. It's a picnic basket. Go full face shield. Not a bad idea, actually, to prevent splashes and protect your face. I think it'd be a very wise choice, and I know other people do it. I just don't happen to have one. Okay. How much does a starter cost for pewter casting on average? It's a little hard to say because it does depend on what you buy. I think the pewter pot is under $50. You may be able to buy pewter from other people rather than spending $100 minimum when you buy pewter the first time. Stone was usually around $4 or $5 a pound, and you really don't need very much of that. Depends a little bit on how many tools you have on hand. I would say you can have everything for less than $200 if you don't include buying a bandsaw. You could have everything for less than $200. I would say most of my non-casting equipment probably totals less than $50.
Do you do your castings just for fun and hand them out, or do you sell them?
Well, both. I love seeing stuff that I've cast on people, and I love wearing stuff that people have cast. These buttons are pewter cast by Temekin. I do sell my pewter. I sell it for cheaper to the SCA than I sell to the public. I have sold at craft sales. My patter, when I walk around, usually at like onto West War, is shiny, shiny pewter at low, low prices, pins, pendants, pornography, and then people invite you into their camp and want to buy stuff from you. So this is the type of stuff I make. Almost all of these were made as a site token initially, and then I sold later. The button is one example that isn't. I was trying to copy but scale up a button for Museum of London, and this one I made for my wedding, so it's a site token but not for an FCA event. And then there are pieces that I've made that I can't sell. Award tokens, the green leaf of Madrone, so I wouldn't sell it as a green leaf. If somebody wanted it for a Laurel collar, we probably could talk. The Sveti Madrone, the lightest St. Bunstable. St. Bunstable's a college that's associated with the University of Washington here in Madrone. That's there once a year. You do a lot for the branch type award. Haven't been given in a while. That college is currently dark and trying to restart in the middle of COVID. And these were personal commissions that I did for people. This, as I mentioned, was for Gemma as princess. She wanted something that looked like a snowflake, and I found something on Kunera's under ornament that looked just like a snowflake and was actually brilliantly easy to carve. The lines of it just made things flow really quickly. So it was a really blessedly easy project. And this was made for Everard. It's a St. Anthony's badge. He wanted something that would work as a belt stiffener, and pewter really isn't hard enough to work as a belt stiffener. But he wouldn't let me buy arrows from him. He insisted on trading for a badge. And so that's how he got a badge. The axe head, and I really apologize, I couldn't find any that are on their sticks, was made for Guillaume. He wanted, this is a recreation of the original. There's quite a few original small axe heads, and they're kind of the medieval foam finger of the tournament era. They all seem to have arms on them. They're all small little axes like this, and I really would love to see lots of branches make them and a kingdom axe head someday, because they're really, really fun to wave around. And we'd already made them for Guillaume, and he'd shared them with people, and we surprised him. He had a surprise Laurel offer and elevation, and we cast 100 of them and gave them to the audience ahead of time, so that when he was called up into court, we all waved his axes. So it was a great success, and that's why that's in the personal category. Challenging to get detailed arms on such a small piece. As I mentioned a little bit in talking about carving and casting, scaling stuff down can really be a challenge. But I hope that answers the question of do I sell my stuff? Yes.
Yes, thank you.
The piece I sell is the windmill, which is $12, and the cheapest thing I sell is a button, which are usually $1 each.
I did not get a chance to see your windmill. I came in at 7:30.
Yeah. You know, it's actually not on the board there because it comes off, but there's the windmill. The windmill is two different pieces. There's a piece that is the house of the windmill and has a stem that sticks forward and a pin back that sticks back. And then the windmill blades are cast in just a two-part mold. Then they're assembled together and gently hammered over to create the peen that holds the blade on but still allows it to turn. They are tricky to assemble, but entirely worth it for an animated bit of pewter.
That was very nice, thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, when I say don't necessarily cast 100% of the time, I do mean that there are times when I have cast 100 casts and gotten one good casting from them. So sometimes casting is really, really frustrating. And there are problem solving we do. And if you want to try this out, I encourage people to join the Pewters Guild Facebook group or form a group of people who also do what you do. So you have people to talk to. It is really nice to be able to say, oh, this isn't casting right. What do you think I should do? Bigger sprue, more venting are the top two answers you're going to get. But there is a community of people who do what you do. And many of us are working solo, but definitely reach out and ask, and people are interested to share their knowledge and experience and help each other out. And if you can, try to work in teams where you have that chance to collaborate and give each other help and feedback. It definitely makes things easier. One of the things that I think is really brilliant, if we can, with Pewter site tokens is the opportunity to offer a variety of site tokens when people arrive at site, especially for a large event like a 12th night or a crown event. Having an assortment of site tokens available that people could pick one that was most appropriate to their persona was an idea that was always really special to me. And I've been able to, a few times, been part of projects where we've done multiple site tokens. The 12th night in 2014, which is actually when my elevation happened, we did 5 tokens that were all purses. So the one that I have, that's the this little purse with the Bollock's dagger, was my contribution. Temekin's bag of dicks was the pornographic offering for that event, and there were several others. Beautiful enameled purse that was done by Morgan Donner, and one that was done with the Wywood arms by Mir, and a nice pouch that was done by Matilda as well. So there's a bunch of different ones, and they're different styles, but they were all in the same theme. Along the same lines, I think it would be really great to be able to offer things to people with Norse personas. We don't tend to find pewter from the Norse Viking era, but we do see other cast metal items, and it is practical and has certainly been done by other pewter artisans to adapt some of those jewelry appearances that you see in other metals to pewter as a way of making persona appropriate or event appropriate or culturally appropriate things in pewter for other time periods. And looking at other art as your source material is certainly logical. We've looked to illuminated manuscript illustrations at times to help clarify how we're drawing the barding or the legs of a creature that's missing its legs. Well, there's a great deal available in the pewter finds, and Cunera is an amazing resource that wasn't around when I started out, and I adore, and really have bought very few books as a result of having access to, because it's all out there on a database, so why buy a book? You don't have to be limited to just what's been cast in pewter before. You can definitely use the pewter casting techniques to make other things. The other thing on my notes was to talk about a few other resources, books, other places to look. This is a book called Metal Buttons by Brian Reed. It might be showing up backwards for you as it is for me. And it is another publication out of England. It's from Portcullis Publishing. The buttons are not all pewter. There are lots of bronze and other buttons. A lot of them are made with techniques that we don't necessarily use. There are pewter buttons that are made with metal shanks cast into them. I didn't get into that, casting pewter multiple parts. That is a thing that can be done, casting other things in with pewter. Nonetheless, there are a lot of pewter buttons in the book, and there's a lot of ways to look at different metal buttons in those time periods. Frequently, what's being done in pewter is copying what's being done in finer metals. So knowing what fashions are happening in the finer metals are pretty useful when you're trying to knock it off in pewter. Books like this are another great resource. I recommend going for a button as your second mold, doing your first mold as a 2-part. It's just good to get sort of used to the material and the casting process first before you get into the complexity of that 3-part for the loop on the button. It's not to say don't you dare, but it's just my recommendation. I think trying the 2-part plane first before we move into the 3rd plane is a wiser choice. The other book I have and just adore is Helig and Profane. This is volume 4. This is published in Dutch. Portions of it are in English, but most of it is in Dutch. I've done a lot of Google Translate, cutting and pasting. However, the Helig and Profane series were sort of the publication half of what we now see on Cunera, coming out of those same Dutch organizations that were doing a lot of research and publication of them. What's really great about this book is that it does have some illustrations that just are super enlarged, which gives us a lot of extra context. I'm gonna get you one of the big pictures. There we go. Well, it's like this. Sometimes seeing a lot of finds grouped together is particularly illuminating for context of shapes and forms and scale and framing and other things that you might find. So one advantage in looking at the books versus looking at the web page is seeing things in groups differently instead of as the databases group them or as your search terms group them. So it's worthwhile to get the books if you can. Interlibrary loan is absolutely your friend for a lot of the books out there. But network with your friends because many of us spend far too much of our money on books of historic nature. I hope this has been a little bit useful. I realize I feel like I've crashed through and barely touched on a lot of things. Encourage you to please reach out to me. You can write to me at baronessspike@gmail.com or baroness@baronyofmadrona.net. Or for that matter, 12th night at ontier.org. That's currently my web address as we're working on a bid for 12th night 2022 and a bid for an ethereal 12th night 2021. Stay tuned. Those are all ways you can reach me. I'm Maddie Dumont on Facebook. I don't take a lot of Facebook message requests, so it's sometimes better to email me. I would love to be able to get stone into people's hands to carve. I do have some stones set aside from classes, and I have in the past prepped stones to give out to people. I know some folks, Basilius here in Madrone was working on prepping his own stone. Last time I went to Artisan Craftsman Supply, which was like March 17th, like the day before lockdown in Seattle, they didn't have any soapstone on hand. The stone they had was all harder or larger than I could cut in the saw I had. So I haven't gone back in the last 6 months to look for more stone. Thank you for kicking my butt to actually get me to talk about pewter and do something in pewter, which has not been happening during the pandemic and lockdown. I would love to see pewter site tokens and pewter awards being made all over on tier in the known world as much as we do here in Madrone, and very much want to help and support those successes. I think it's a really fun art that a lot of people can get into. But also, I have found, having taught several classes over the years, some people just don't enjoy the process of carving in negative. And that visualization and that process doesn't suit everybody. So please give it a try. I hope it really does suit you and it's an art you take to, but also don't be really hard on yourself if it doesn't. It's like knitting or sewing or null binding or anything. Some people are naturals at it and some people aren't. And if it doesn't make you happy, try something else. There's lots of other arts out there that might make you happier. Oh, good. Pureleaf adds that Dick Blick sells soapstone. So definitely worth looking into. I have bought stone from an estate sale of a stone carver and found that some of it was harder than we wanted to use for carving. So if at all possible, do your thumbnail test as you're buying soapstone. And definitely, as you make things, save your early work and save each other's early work. Save the pewter of other people. It's really wonderful to look back and see all the site tokens and all the evolution. I know that Sean always keeps pieces from all the classes he teaches. So as you start your work, I'd love to please save it up and share it with me when you see me at events in the future. I would love to see what you make.
What was the name of that Facebook group? Is that the Medieval Pewter Guild?
Let me
Pewterers Guild, right?
I'm gonna look at a different computer just because I have my Facebook on it usually. As I said, it certainly hasn't been active in a long time. I think that is right. Yeah, Medieval Pewterers Guild. Yeah, there's a nice stone brochure there. I know Bespoke Pewter is another pewter outfit. Dan Taus is one of the people posting there, and I think that, yeah, he's posting from Bespoke Pewter. So some of the other people who are producing pewter and taking commissions and so forth are in that group, and it's a good way to be connected to them.
Thank you.
Well, with apologies, folks, I have an early work day tomorrow, so I do need to wrap up the evening. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble about pewtering. I hope it was inspiring, and I would love to see what gets made in the future.
Thank you
very much.
Yeah, it was very enjoyable, your class. I mean, I'm so glad that you did this for us. Terra Pomaria does have a great pewter artist, Rafe Newton. He does all our tokens and stuff. But it was great having you teach for us. And I'm losing my train of thought because it's late here. My wife has already gone to bed. So
Good. It is a good time for us all to wrap up. Thank you and good night.
But thank you.
Night.